It began, as such stories often do, with something quite ordinary. The disappearance of Arthur Whitmore was, at first, simply an inconvenience. A respectable gentleman of 48, an experienced hiker and a devoted outdoorsman, Arthur had set out for his annual retreat to the vast and untamed wilderness of Black Hollow National Park. A week of solitude, a time to reconnect with nature, a time to get his thoughts in order. At least, that had been Mr. Whitmore's plan. Arthur, being a stickler for both detail and, of course, safety, had informed his sister Margaret of his itinerary. 3 days up to Clearwater Ridge, another 2 circling back along the Shadow Creek Trail. "I should be back by Sunday," he had said in his matter-of-fact voice, checking his gear with meticulous precision. Margaret, though never one to meddle, had secretly been displeased with her brother's decision to go on a solo hike. He was not getting any younger, and she really felt he should be going with a friend for safety's sake, but she reluctantly kept her opinion to herself. Instead, she gently pressed him to take precautions and asked him to check in whenever possible. The park was known for its treacherous terrain, its sudden weather changes, and, if local whispers were to be believed, things far more unsettling. While Margaret felt the whispered rumours were utter nonsense, she was a stickler for safety. When Sunday evening finally rolled around and Arthur had not returned, Margaret grew quite concerned. She had her misgivings about this whole trip from the beginning, but her brother was a stubborn man, and there had been no use arguing with him. By Monday morning, Margaret was growing rather alarmed that she still had not heard from her brother, so she reported his absence to the park rangers. They kindly assured her there was likely nothing to worry about. Hikers often lost track of time. Still, to alleviate her concerns, a small search party was assembled. The first day yielded little, a few footprints leading off the designated trail, an abandoned campfire, but no sign of Arthur himself. The second day turned up something far more peculiar. His pack, neatly set against a tree, its contents undisturbed, as if it had been deliberately placed there. His water bottle was still full, his compass intact, his provisions untouched. It was as if he had simply walked away, leaving everything behind. This left Margaret gravely concerned, as this was very unlike her meticulously organized brother. By the third day, whispers began to circulate among the searchers. For decades the locals, those who had lived on the fringes of the park for generations, had spoken in hushed tones of the Watchers. These were not bears nor mountain lions, but something else, something, they insisted, that did not belong to the realm of men. There were legends of silent figures moving between the trees, of eerie, unnatural stillness when one strayed too far from the path. "It happened again. Told you it would," one grizzled ranger muttered, the fear he felt palpable, though he refused to elaborate further. Margaret, ever the pragmatist, dismissed such stories as utter nonsense. Arthur was a rational, careful man. He did not take foolish risks, as one of the rangers had suggested in a rather condescending though roundabout way. And yet the evidence, or rather the lack thereof, gnawed at her. The forest seemed to swallow answers before they could be formed, as if it was purposefully keeping its secrets. "This is ridiculous," Margaret chided herself. "A forest cannot hold a secret." Still, the aching ball of anxiety in the pit of her stomach continued to grow with each passing moment that her dear brother remained missing. On the 5th day, searchers found another quite disturbing clue. It was a notebook half buried in the underbrush, clearly belonging to Arthur. The first few entries listed the birds and other wildlife he'd spotted along his hike. In the last few years, he'd developed quite an interest in all things avian, and had enthusiastically noted each bird he'd seen, and a few tidbits on their behaviours that he'd observed. The final entry, however, was scrawled hastily across the page. It ominously read, "Something is following me. Not an animal, not a man. It watches from the trees. It knows when I look for it. The trees are wrong. Silence is unnatural. If someone finds this, please tell—" The message ended abruptly, the last couple of words scribbled indecipherably. This is the last trace of Arthur that the searchers were ever able to find. There was no body, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle ever found. Only that ominous note and the sense that something unseen and unknowable had been there in the trees, watching, waiting, stalking. Eventually, Margaret received the official report that ruled it a case of misadventure. Arthur had been lost to the wilderness, the rangers deeming it an unfortunate accident. But those in the search party and the locals who had scoured the forest relentlessly, they all knew better. They spoke in careful tones, eyes glancing apprehensively toward the shadowed ridges. Something had taken Arthur Whitmore, something that did not leave footprints or traces, something that the forest itself seemingly wanted to hide. Sadly, like so many before him and so many after, Mr. Arthur Whitmore became another name on a long list. An ever-growing list of those who had walked into Black Hollow but never walked out. As the months passed, Margaret simply could not bring herself to let the mystery rest. She could not give up on her dearest brother. Hours were spent poring over Arthur's notes, maps, and past hiking routes. Desperate for answers, she spoke to locals and to those who had been members of the search and rescue team. Each conversation led to more questions and more strange details that were unearthed. Old maps clearly showed trails that no longer existed and caves that were somehow no longer there. Older residents continued to warn that there were areas of the forest that were best left alone. One elderly gentleman, Amos Hargrove, who'd been born in the area, offered Margaret a chilling warning. "Some places weren't meant for us. The forest has rules of its own. It is wise to obey them, you know." Refusing to elaborate on his cryptic message, he pressed an old yellowed newspaper clipping into her hand before shuffling slowly away. When Margaret read the article, dated nearly 50 years prior, it told of another hiker who had vanished in Black Hollow under eerily similar circumstances. No trace of the gentleman had ever been found, only his journal, describing the same ominous sense of being watched, the same unnatural silence. Margaret read and reread the words, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Tears began forming in her eyes at the hopelessness of the situation as a creeping fear left goosebumps covering her skin. Determined to uncover the truth, she gathered up the nerve to return to Black Hollow Park and retrace Arthur's steps. At first she found nothing unusual until she reached the spot where his pack had been left. Almost immediately the air began to feel heavier, suffocating. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, were strangely absent. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as a creeping unease settled over her. "This is ridiculous. You're letting your imagination run away with you." Almost convinced that she was overreacting, she squared her shoulders and determinedly resumed her search of the area. Then she saw it, a faint imprint in the rain-softened dirt. Not a footprint exactly, not quite. It was elongated, distorted, as if something had crouched there, watching, waiting. The strange, unnerving sight sent a shiver down her spine. Her pulse hammering in fear, Margaret quickly snapped a photograph of the odd print. Was this left by whatever had taken her brother? Dear God, was she to be the next victim? Unable to shake the fear of whatever was out there, Margaret quickly returned to the hiking trail, continuously glancing over her shoulder as she headed out of the forest. She could never bring herself to return, but the constant feeling of being watched never left her. Over time, the legend of the Watchers grew, but it continued to be ignored by authorities. And the forest remained as it always had, silent, unknowable, and patiently waiting for its next victim.